the colonial state, and settler-colonial modernism. It seems obvious that modernity produces states, societies, and subjects in varied ways, so it is striking that conventional studies of contemporary democracy exclude the driving force in South Africa, the barrel of a gun. Yet, bringing the idea that modernity was imposed through violence into the analysis of South African politics can explain why state-sponsored violence continues and generalized violence permeates society even after the establishment of electoral democracy. The anomalies and contradictions of the bourgeois democratic model in South Africa can be interpreted more persuasively with reference to settler-colonial modernity. As a pragmatic case of Frantz Fanon's 1963 analysis of settler-colonial modernity, this chapter draws on Fanon, Michael Foucault, and Giorgio Agamben to understand how modernity in South Africa unfolded by the constitution of its subjects through settler-colonial violence. The discussion is organized into four broad themes: the emergence of colonial relations out of slave society, wars of expansion and the consolidation of the state as a source of centralized power, the relationship between mannequin society and class, and lastly, apartheid capitalism and its contradictions that post-colonial democracy cannot resolve. The chapter ends by reiterating that the post-apartheid experiment with liberal democracy will remain limited if it is framed as a fundamental rupture with its past. That key assumption of recent third-wave democratization literature excludes the history of violence in the processes of the making of modern South Africa and its legacies for the modern state, racialized capitalism, and racialized subjects. Understanding modernity and its questions in South Africa. Guha's observation that the colonial experience consists of three elements, namely violence, exploitation, and legality, holds true for South Africa. The violence associated with settler colonialism in South Africa and the subaltern responses to overcome it made the Western-type political modernity that Gilroy describes as bourgeois democracy in the genteel metropolitan guise improbable. The process by which modernity unfolded in the southern part of Africa introduced colonial states in the wake of the destruction or reordering of local polities that were themselves undergoing processes of political consolidation. Spurred on by an unquenchable thirst for land, labor, and eventually mining profits, settler colonialism forced disparate groups into newly imagined national, quote-unquote, territories. The new power racially organized the emerging polity into rigid hierarchies, cutting the world into two, and thereby produced racialized subjects, black and white, or native and settler, that were violently incomplete because their identities depended entirely on the other. Approaching the state from the perspective of the particularity of settler colonial imposed modernity highlights two features. The process of capitalist imperialist expansion imposed this modernity violently from the outset, and the state, which once instituted as part of this process, evolved into the primary instrument that managed the system of settler colonialism. The state created the impression of centrally concentrated power. It introduced the crucial distinctiveness, instruments, knowledge, and procedures within the new colonial power dynamic, while also imposing and maintaining it. A new distinctive monopoly of violence effectively coordinated the project to produce racialized subjects based on the racial difference in colonial discourse between colonizer and colonized. In the 1970s, the relationship between modernity and racism attracted much scholarly debate, which demonstrated that South African studies remained within the orbit of Eurocentric habits of thought. On the one hand, in Marxist approaches, the key problem with South Africa is that the majority black workforce was denied political rights. Unlike in other industrialized capitalist countries, their exclusion from the political system explained the sustained racial policies targeting blacks and essentially discriminating against them. However, this can be identified as a problem or anomaly only if the Western capitalist trajectory is accepted as the universal standard. This distinctive feature in South Africa stems from the relationship between capitalism and racism. How is it that a developed capitalist base relates to an archaic superstructure, which is organized around an ideology promoting deep racial divisions in the society? On the other hand, liberal modernization approach identifies it as representing the tension between adaptive modern imperatives, the backward, obstinate traditionalism of African peasant culture, and the Afrikaner ideology shaped by harsh frontier experience. This earlier debate remains influential in the analysis of South African politics. The key moment of modernity in Marxist scholarship lay in the economics of the mining revolution, namely the emergence of extensive market society and capitalism. Liberal discourse considered the positive role of British colonial policies in introducing central administrative structures, legal codes, and Enlightenment ideas as fundamental. To explain apartheid as a political order of state and society, it focused on Afrikaner-influenced racist practice, whereas Marxist thought emphasized the racial organization of the mining economy and its undermining of class dynamics to accumulate increased surplus value. The differences turned on whether modernity contradicts or complements the racial hierarchies that seemed common sense in this settler-colonial society. The liberal school had faith that capitalism would eventually overcome the anachronism of systematic racial discrimination after the discovery by South African capitalists that continual dependence on migrant labor would prove unprofitable in the long run. An early Marxist critique of the liberal view, Frederick Johnston, identified that he considered to be the weak premises of the liberal thesis. Economic development contradicted white supremacist ideology. Capitalist industrialization and the market were modernizing, but segregationist and apartheid policies were backward-looking and expressed rigid ideology due to the high turnover of unskilled workers. Market efficiencies would make migrant labor obsolete, and capitalist industrialization would require skilled and semi-skilled labor. And those contradictions would likely result in the political conflict resolving itself through negotiation and elite accommodation. He disagreed that a contradictory relationship existed between capitalism and white supremacist political ideology. Capitalist industrialization and the market were not necessarily liberalizing, nor were segregationist and apartheid policies always backward-looking and rigid. He also insisted that the demand for skilled and semi-skilled labor and migrant labor inefficiencies would not be resolved through reforms and elite accommodation. The discovery of diamonds and gold in the late 19th century ushered in capitalist production, linking South Africa to the developing imperialist global system. The mining sector established coercive labor regulations, political and ideological racist expressions preached black inferiority, white superiority, and the super exploitation of African mine workers. The states and mining companies established elaborate mechanisms to prevent labor unrest and to secure constant labor supply. The backward political and ideological policies were necessary for capitalist accumulation, at least as a definite stage of its development. After all, state labor laws enabled the enforcement of extremely low wages to African workers because they prevented African unionization, disallowed racially mixed trade unions, reversed skilled jobs for whites, and restricted the wives, children, and extended family of African workers to barren homelands. South African capitalism historically depended on and benefited from a racial division of labor. Marxist theory conventionally interprets these state interventions as cheapening the cost of African labor, allowing the capitalist class to rake in super profits from racist policies. Although Marxist writing acknowledges that racism is traceable to the colonial encounter, it draws too strict a separation between the colonial past and the origins of racist labor laws that were designed to address the mining industry's demands, and restrictively emphasizes the role of mining capital in the foundations of modernity and racism. In the formation of the racialized state and the construction of racialized subjects, Marxist analysis tends to ignore the role of pre-capitalist ideas and practices that directly contributed towards and or prepared the ground for the later capitalist mode to ground itself. Further, white citizens from all classes, including capitalist mine and farm workers, white workers, and the middle classes, benefited from apartheid, colonial laws, and the informal privileges that came with the white identity. Marxist analysis typically avoided the subjectivity of the colonized, on which Fanon and Biko focused, the humiliations and the politics of skin and body and mind. Instead, it explored how racism was objectively functional to capitalist accumulation, which it promoted along with the capitalist class. Marxist analysis has been unwilling to adopt Fanon's suggestion. The originality of the colonial context is that the economic reality, inequality, the immense difference of ways of life never came to mask the human realities. What parcels out the world is to begin with the fact of belonging or not belonging to a given race. In the colonies, the economic the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. The conventional and dominant understanding of how capitalism, read economics or modernity, related to apartheid, read political system, and or pre-modernity, echoed Eurocentric and historicist thinking. Although liberal and Marxist approaches were at opposite extremes of this scale, they were joined at the hip about the idea that capitalism and its agent capital spreads outwards and arises in one part of the world at a particular period and then develops globally over historical time, encountering and negotiating historical differences in the process. The capitalist mode of production promises an end stage or prepares the ground for socialism. In liberal thought, it ends with abstract individuals freely contracting with one another in an unbiased market and inhibiting a civil society in which equal citizenship rights apply to all. This template is thought to describe a universal process, so the toolbox of concepts that it generated strongly influenced the social sciences' interest in comparative development. However, it approximates the European and North American experience of capitalism. Fanon made clear that mannequin society fundamentally breaks with this self-image and understanding of capitalism. He wrote that this requires examining how colonizing power articulated itself through colonial difference, i.e., the zone of its politics in securing its domination. According to Chakrabarty, Writers of subaltern history must give up neither Marx nor difference. Writers of subaltern history must give up neither Marx nor difference. In South Africa and the Third World generally, the conquest state is the main character of the narrative of political modernity. That does not mean that other elements of modernity, capital, its agent or the capitalist class, and discourses that normalize docile bodies had no or marginal roles to play. Instead, because they function in a theater defined by the violent relationship of colonizer to the colonized, the state is the key driver and mediator. The state's mediation is one impetus for the mode of capitalism's emergence and consolidation, its role in monopolizing violence and bureaucratic power to destroy rival sovereigns, to control the bodies of the colonized and consider the black mass as homo sacer in another. Fanon reversed Marx's famous metaphor when analyzing the colonial situation, warning that the elements of the superstructure determined the economic base. It must be accepted that black subjects are molded by pervasive legal violence, and the state of exception was a permanent feature of black life. The conventional analysis of democracy assumes that, as modernity spreads from the Western centers of economic and political power to other parts of the world, it tends to produce societies similar to those of the modern West, and that modernity describes a single homogeneous process that can be traced to a single causal principle. For Marx, that single causal principle is capitalist commodity production, i.e., the commodification of life. For Weber, it is the ever-expanding iron cage of rationalization that suffocates all spheres of social life. Unfolding democracies in southern Africa are thus disappointing because they hardly mirror the typical Western model, but both assumptions are wrong. Kavariraj arrived at the prudent conclusion that we should expect modernity not to be homogeneous. In the everyday practices of its subjects, modernity introduces a racial rupture. The social practices are molded by the interaction of previous embedded practices, the subject's willingness, and local power dynamics. Consequently, modernity does not operate on a clean slate, but imposes itself as a combination of many different processes that interact but follow their own logic. They do not form a coherent package or necessarily follow an identical sequence. In South Africa, for example, the colonial state rationalized the control of colonized subjects and labor in the productive sphere. The introduction of the Bantu Education Act 1953 allowed the black masses to be educated, but aimed to produce subjects with no or few skills. In contrast, India's Macaulay's minute turned educated Indians into non-white Englishmen and women. Kavariraj also encouraged the study of modernity's approaches to collective agency and social mobilization, which normally entails monitoring existing practices and the reflection of other societies, i.e. their past, present, and future. The elites may even intend to achieve their modernizing goals differently because they feel alienated from the Western experience of modernity. Hence, later modernities will not replicate the experiences of the West. Kavariraj's reservations are helpful for understanding the unique, red violent, processes by which modernity produces states, societies, and relationally incomplete racialized subjects in Southern Africa. In the previous chapters, I have argued that the conventional analysis proposes a historicist notion of political modernity and that, framed ethnocentrically, third-wave democracy sets as its goal and standard the bourgeois democracy in the genteel metropolitan guise. It does not account for the way that settler colonialism shaped the emergence of post-apartheid, post-colonial democracy. The history of violence becomes more significant as it is better understood how the nationalist modern project became mired in crisis, why elites and masses go off in different directions, and how politics is fought in the terrains of civil and political society, despite the once unifying nationalist struggle. It also makes it possible to question and reframe the contradictions of the post-apartheid bourgeois democratic model. The colonial situation as violent rupture. From the first days of conquest, the violence meted out to local communities revealed that each member was considered as homo sacer, someone without political significance, whose killing was neither worthy of judicial evaluation nor religious sacrifice. They were always vulnerable to excessive violence. From the colonizer's perspective, the conquest introduced progress, enlightenment, and modernization to an almost barren and savage land. Racist attitudes are attested from the moment of settlement. Jan van Riebeeck, the first commander of the Cape of Good Hope, referred to the local Khoi, Hottentots, as the black stinking dogs who should be killed in 1652. In the initial colonial encounter, the local San and Khoi people faced the dreadful choice of taking up arms and facing death or renouncing their autonomy to participate in the political community as slaves. This situation resonates with Agamben's thinking about bare life as relative to zo, what remains when the political community that provides significance is destroyed. Yet what remains when local communities are considered valueless and their members savages in situations of colonial conquest is a different question. What remains when the people found in these lands are considered as having no political value or sense of the good life? According to Wood, the economic imperatives behind capitalist imperialist expansion produced legal principles, res nullius, literally that which belongs to no one, or ownerless land, racial stereotypes of laziness, indigenous peoples are non-productive and therefore without a right to land, racism, Europeans were superior, therefore conquest was a European right, and the belief that the seizure of indigenous land would eventually benefit the natives. This initial encounter developed into the colonial division of labor along collar hierarchies, with unskilled hard work considered inappropriate for Europeans. Armstrong and Worden discovered that by the late 18th century, the Cape Colony had become one of the most closed and rigid slave societies so far analyzed by historians. It became normal for masters to be white and slaves to be black. Once the defeated had been incorporated into colonial relations of domination, those blacks, the San, Khoi, imported slaves, and conquered tribal groups experienced bar life in the sense that of the zone of indistinction and continuous transaction between man and beast, and were always potential targets of violence that did not amount to crime. Their exclusion from the settlement paradoxically included them because it enabled the idea of bios and a life of political significance. What eventually became sovereign power, spanning the long, complex, and differentiated period from Van Riebeeck's military garrison of the mid-17th century to the modern, bureaucratic South African state in 1910, thus came with colonial conquest, settlement, and slavery. The history of the state starts with the establishment of a fortress settlement of the Dutch East India Company, a trading company, military enterprise on the shores of Cape Town in 1652. The colonial state grew gradually from this halfway station, which supported the DEIC's shipping crews between Holland and its East Asian territories. This limited and perhaps temporary administrative base grew gradually as Dutch farmers were allowed to settle further away. The small convict population and the resistance from Khoi and San communities led the Dutch East India Company to import slaves. In 1658, the Dutch East India Company bought 228 slaves from Dahomey and traded 174 slaves from a captured Portuguese slaver bound for Brazil. The slave population grew from these blacks held in bondage in the Cape, although recurring outbreaks of disease, such as the large smallpox epidemic of 1713, killed many. By 1750, almost half of the male free burghers in the colony had at least one slave when British forces occupied the Cape in 1798. The slave population exceeded that of free burghers. Slaves' racial background was not distinguished. African, Malagasy, Indian, and Indonesian slaves were called interchangeably slaven or leefwegen, slaves, or literally life property. All persons of color, whether slave or free, were referred to as zwarte, black, or vryzwarte, free blacks, was the label for slaves who had bought their freedom or who had received their manumission from their masters. The few farmers with monopoly privileges, though the so-called pacht law, to supply the Dutch East India Company needed many slaves. Adriaan van der Stel, 1699 to 1707, used them to become the biggest landowner, the biggest cattle and wheat farmer, the biggest wine grower, and slave owner. But in the early period of the Dutch East India Company control, most slave owners had fewer than 5 slaves. This domestic slavery encouraged rigid dichotomy between the life worlds of the master and the slave and reinforced the status and honor of slave ownership. There were significantly fewer manumissions at the Cape than in other slave societies. Local penalties and the Statutes of India of 1642 applied to all slaves, no matter their place of origin. They required slaves to possess a signed letter from their master whenever they ran errands, carry lighted torches at night, and observe curfews, and not to carry firearms or gather in groups of more than 3. Bolstered by extreme punishments, they gave masters absolute power. Slaves caught stealing or accused of attacking their masters would be put to death. A placard, proclamation, of 1714 allowed settlers to shoot on sight any runaway slaves. Punishment routinely included gruesome torture. The branding of faces was so common that, in 1727, a law was passed to move its usual location to slaves' backs, out of consideration for the feelings of the Europeans, particularly pregnant women, who might encounter them. The scattering of isolated farms across the Cape Peninsula and the small numbers of slaves to each master left slaves vulnerable. Owners were rarely punished for severe violence towards slaves. In contrast to Armstrong and Worden, who countered 2 slave uprisings involving small numbers, Foreman wrote about slave revolts in 1707, 1714, 1719, and 1765. It was more common for slaves to resist less dramatically by running away from farms, converting to and openly practicing Islam, developing their own vernacular, Afrikaans, petitioning the Dutch East India Company, and even joining the Khoi and San communities. The demand for land and labor was the common interest of both the company state and the free burghers, and it pitted them against the locals who wanted to protect their land, patterns of subsistence, and communities. The steadily growing settler farming population clashed with the Dutch East India Company over its restrictive, sovereign-like control. Although it retained a monopoly on the purchase of goods at fixed prices and prevented contacts with local Hottentots by disallowing land grabs beyond the colony's borders, At no time was the company able or willing to bring European settlement firmly under its control. It promoted freehold land at first, but rented farms annually, £5 for 6,000 acres, from 1717. As long as farmers paid rent, they could use the land as their own. It became common for a boer youth leaving his father's farm to walk his horse for an hour in 4 directions from a central point to determine the size of his farm. This encouraged larger land grabs and movement into the interior of the country. Through war and plunder, the small, slave-based agricultural Cape Colony moved to mass settlement in the 18th century. The trekboers, outward expansion, the intervention of Imperial Britain, and the eventual drawing up of present-day South Africa. Crucially, the sovereign was externally imposed and created the political community by excluding bare life or black life, which simultaneously included it by the virtue of its absence of political significance and thus left blacks vulnerable to extreme violence. The state remained an entity of violence. Its rationale was to obtain compliance in a society divided unequally according to race. Even the so-called colorblind Cape Constitution of 1853 set a £25 property qualification for voting that all but excluded the few non-white voters otherwise treated as citizens. The general laws protected the settlers while targeting colonized blacks and exposing them to sovereign violence. In this settler-colonial formation, the state first established sovereign control over the territory and its inhabitants, and then, through various systems of forced labor, exploited them for the benefit of the settler population. The wars that started against the Khoi and San in the 17th century ended in the late 19th century with the defeat of the Xhosa. In this period, the state honed its instruments of violence and its war-making capacity. In this process of state and society formation, coercion far outweighed market forces and, as demonstrated by the settlers' dependence upon extra-economic interventions, even in the emerging sphere of production, free markets had little meaning outside ideology. The colonial state and war-making. The modern state is the state as it developed in Europe. Whether the focus is on characteristics, functions, or relations within or out, European history provides the standard definition and theories of the state. Universal or quote universal characteristics gleaned from this regional experience include an administrative structure, association, territory, and national claims to represent the polity. Although the European process of state formation came about largely as a result of internal processes that over time produced a central authoritative apparatus, it serves as the yardstick even when it is evidently inapplicable. States are marked by their particular histories, yet all intend to regulate the behavior of persons within their territory. In his 1918 lecture, Politics as a Vocation, Max Weber highlighted the state's association with violence. The state as an association among many should be defined by its means and not by its ends or tasks, and the specific means peculiar to it, as to every political association, namely, is the use of physical force. Although force is not the only means available to the state, it is unique to the state. In a given territory, many associations historically may have had access to force, but only the state acquired a monopoly and can use it legitimately. In other words, in Weber's view, the state has the right to use violence enshrined in the law. The Weberian state is never isolated from relations of domination because its rationale is to obtain obedience supported by legitimate violence. Weber attributed the inner justifications for obedience to 3 ideal types of legitimacy: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. The legal rational values dominate the modern state, but all are present. In Europe, the outcome of the battle to achieve this monopoly of legitimate violence separated the relationship between the executive staff from the means of administration. Weber defined the state in relation to this monopoly of force and not in the terms of social contract theory. The modern state is a compulsory association which organizes domination. It has been successful in seeking to monopolize the legitimate use of physical force as a means of domination within a territory. To this end, the state has combined the material means of organization in the hands of its leaders, and it has expropriated all autonomous functionaries of the states who formally control these means in their own right. The state has taken their positions and now stands in the top place. That states are products of war is relevant to understanding the modern state in South Africa, although its colonial permutation is different from that of Europe. Influenced by Weber, Charles Tilly argued that war-making is inseparable from capital accumulation due to the power holders' need to extract resources, including capital, by outright plunder, regular tribute, or bureaucratic taxation from a territory's population in return for protection. This extortion of local inhabitants is racketeering. One person or organization offers protection from their own violence and insecurity. Tilly's metaphor also describes how the state makes inroads into society to eventually become a dominant force of regulation. It participates in the process of war-making, state-making, protection, and extraction, which establish the basis for state legitimacy. The practice of war-making eliminates enemies, i.e. state competition, outside the territory, while the state-making activities eliminate enemies and competition within. Each of these interdependent aspects are constitutive of the modern state. War-making with the military, state-making with governing institutions, protection with the courts and representative assemblies, and extraction with fiscal structures. In the dominant narrative, these internally generated processes and emerging capitalist social relations from the mid-15th century describe the formation of the state in Western Europe. Tilly's analysis is relevant to understanding modern state formation in South Africa because it highlights the differences from the European trajectory. It was a sovereign force and imposed from without. Yet, because it was motivated by interests of imperialism, it borrowed knowledge and adapted its learning and techniques of state building, population control, and regulating bodies from Europe. The so-called frontier wars, which incorporated people and territory into the expanding colonial or political order, were significant to state building. Davenport, 1977, presented detailed accounts of the 10 wars fought against the Xhosa between 1779 and 1879, and Leonard Thompson and Monica Wilson identified the important dates and wars of this colonial expansion. During 100 years, the boundary shifted eastward. In 1772, some Xhosa mingled with the Khoikhoi, were living on the Kamtuas, and in 1806, the boundary was the Fish. In 1811, Ndlambe with 20,000 followers were pushed across it. In 1819, the boundary between the Fish and the Iskama was declared neutral. By 1824, it was partially or partly occupied by whites. In 1847, the boundary shifted to the Gai. In 1855, the Mbashe. In 1878, to the Mtata. And in 1894, Pondo land between the Mtata and Ndamvuna was annexed. As the frontier moved outwards, the Griqua, Zulu, Southern Sotho, Tswana, Swazi, and finally the Mpondo and East Griqua were conquered. The war divided the population of the colony into a political community of significance and a majority defined by its vulnerability to arbitrary violence. In the colonial narrative, every victory in war against local communities registered an expansion of civilization, the civilization mission. The discovery of diamond deposits in 1867 and gold in 1886 precipitated a sense of urgency in the British Colonial Office to stabilize the political community, bring law and order, and secure its imperialist control over the region. Whitehall decided that the Cape government should function as its instrument, although it recognized the administration's weakness in the face of formidable challenges. Afrikaner republics were too independent, African polities retained too much control, and Germany posed potential threat to British interests. The correspondence behind the appointment of Bartel Frere as the new High Commissioner of Southern Africa in Cape Town in 1877 reveals this imperialist vision. In 1876, Frere received a letter of invitation from the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, Henry Herbert, Earl of Carnarvon, setting out Carnarvon's vision for the political reorganization into a confederation of the South African region under British control. He saw the solution to restructuring an uncivilized, chaotic political landscape into a confederation of federal states governed by London. He chose Frere, he said, because of Frere's skills, colonial wisdom, and experience. Carnarvon promised Frere the status of a governor, and an even higher position in the confederation succeeded. He warned Frere that his appointment took place at the edge of a great native war, so the position was one of extreme delicacy from its political as well as its native complications. Carnarvon's reference to political referred to delicate relations between the local whites, the British, and their relations with the Afrikaner republics. He believed the natives were incapable of practicing or participating in politics. He saw the war between the Transvaal and the natives as an opportunity to increase the role of Britain in the region, a political opening for a spreading imperialism. Frere's task was going to be difficult and responsible, but also great, as it would bring the new machine of government to this uncivilized land. Frere's response was, at first sight, strange. He demanded more money to take on the mission, although he acknowledged the responsibility to be great and reiterated his commitment to his country and spreading civilization. Although Frere contributed to the Boer War after taking up the post, he then believed the British annexation was necessary and beneficial to all, especially after the discovery of diamonds and gold. Imperial intervention would bring civilization, political community, peace, and law. In startling contrast to Guillaume's sympathetic view of the Afrikaner republics, Frere viewed the Afrikaner republics as corrupt, bankrupt, and run by uncivilized Afrikaners from whom the citizens needed to be saved. He envisioned Britain's role as a mediator between Afrikaners and natives, but clearly preferred the whites because he feared the natives were uncivilized. He saw the annexation of the Transvaal and the war with the border republics and Zulu kingdom as necessary for achieving the larger goal of ordering of the region into a confederation if these two groups challenged British authority and remained independent. Yet Martineau, who compiled the correspondence, never mentioned the discovery of diamonds and gold as reasons for the annexation of the Transvaal. Instead, he blamed the breakout of war on Shepstone's hastiness, the delayed correspondence between London and Cape Town, and decisions taken in London without reference to local administrators' local knowledge. Imperialist Britain subordinated African polities through war, settlement, trade, treaties, and labor policies. While the outcomes were not inevitable, Lenin identified the structural imperatives behind global expansion. The system of capitalism or capitalist accumulation needed to move capital, goods, and people from Europe and required new markets, new material, and exploitable populations from the colonies. But why the extensive violence and brutal occupation, including the killing of whole populations? In her study of the relationship of capitalism and colonialism to violence, Ellen Wood noted that British colonialism was more penetrating than Spanish or Portuguese. They were extractive, but it wanted to recreate profit-making in the zones themselves. These economic and ideological imperatives were interconnected in legal notions of empty land, dominant ideas that indigenous people were lazy and non-productive, and racist beliefs of superior and inferior peoples. Wood identified that res nullius principle, that the civilized were obliged to take over empty, unproductive land to make it productive, made British colonialism so violent. For British colonialism, it was a moral justification of violent conquest, settlement, and the large-scale exploitation of labor. In practice, it allowed the imperial power to demonstrate its power to bring death even to indigenous kings. In 1820 to 1835, King Hinsa of the Xhosa had made counterclaims to being a sovereign in his own right, based on long tradition. Lieutenant General Benjamin D. Urban, the governor of the Cape Colony, sent Colonel Harry Smith to lead the frontier war in 1834, and the British fought the Xhosa at Grahamstown. When he was considering a British demand to give up 50,000 of his people's cattle during peace talks, he was arrested, held hostage, and killed, apparently while trying to escape. While Smith watched, Hintsa's body was mutilated. The severed head was taken to Britain. De Urban claimed more land from those irreclaimable savages, extending as far as the Kai River. This subjugation by bloodshed enabled the colonial state to stabilize, claim, and empirically demonstrate its monopoly of violence. In the colonial situation, it did not matter that it lacked the legitimacy Weber considered so central to state domination. Yet, even power expressed largely through violence allows for symbolic ambiguities. Take, for example, the scene of King Solomon Ka-Dinzulu, leader of the Zulus, at a meeting attended by the British Governor-General of the Union of South Africa, Alexander Cambridge, Earl of Athlone, in 1930. Solomon thought that he should be recognized with the same degree of respect as Athlone, and he openly belittled British rule by criticizing it, laughing at its authorities, and speaking to his followers rather than addressing the meeting or Athlone. Annoyed British representatives waited for him and his followers to salute Athlone with Bayete, a Zulu sign of royal respect. Instead, the crowd shouted Bayeza, they come, which was vaguely threatening. Solomon exited the meeting before Athlone, and the people shouted Bayete as he moved through them. Still, he understood his own position as ambiguous in the big power game. He believed that only people of royal blood are fitted to rule, but was also aware that the chieftain class were in the pay of the colonial authorities, and thus required to collect taxes from an impoverished peasantry. With each victory in the war against local resistance, the state improved its control mechanisms to ensure compliance with new rules of behavior that served the new ruling order. But this centralized power of the colonial state, and later the apartheid state, was not exercised on a tabula rasa. Previous indigenous polities had been ruled by minority power holders who disregarded subalterns. The emerging colonial power built upon these patterns of domination and accommodated and reinforced existing traditional structures of power and their associated normative orders. Its biggest allies were chiefs, whose legitimacy came from hierarchies of power rooted in a different cultural order, and the central state exercised its power through these intermediaries whenever possible to regulate the subaltern's behavior. It manipulated and clashed with the intermediary structures only if the central state's core strategic interests warranted it. Crucially, the colonial and then apartheid state claimed sovereign status from the very beginning but achieved the unwilling subjects' recognition only through coercion. War-making enhanced the colonial state by extending British imperial domination. As Mitchell observed, it also taught the British how to defeat its enemies, and this new knowledge of politically subjugating and regulating defeated populations further bolstered its techniques of power in the colonies and Europe. The conflicts and outcomes of the South African colonial encounter followed a pattern. Unresolved disputes over land, cattle, and ultimately political authority between settlers and natives led to wars. African defeat led to the redrawing of boundaries to extend white control, and defeated Africans became laborers and subjects of colonial sovereignty. Significantly, the laboring class's status defined it outside the political community to include it as the other. Defeated African elites and their subjects lost the power to determine the rules of their everyday modes of subsistence. Their historically established cultural repertoire was radically reconfigured, and they had no choice but to accept the new sovereign and its awesome capacity to regulate life and death. Foucault and the production of docile subjects. The racial hierarchy, Fanon's mannequin society, prevailed in South Africa from the very beginning of colonial rule. The colonial state adopted laws of master and servant, which built upon the earlier slave code. Under apartheid, the restrictive laws applied to blacks followed suit. For example, the 1952 influx control laws adopted by the Nationalist Party government were little different from the restrictions on slave movement in the 17th century, which were revised by the British colonial government in the Pass Laws of 1896. The laws and everyday social interactions marked the society as racialized, with race as the master signifier. In Fanon's analysis, these conditions make for unique methods of disciplining and constituting subjects, because the rules governing and regulating everyday life are directed at producing racialized subjects, which is another expression of violence. The message to the targeted subject is, you are nothing, you are merely the bearers of their life, and your identity is that you are living and vulnerable to death and precarious life. Blacks were excluded from a form of life with political significance on the basis that they were less than fully human, inferior to whites, and therefore unworthy of citizenship. Whereas accounts of modernization conceived of the state in relation to an inevitable modernity with little acknowledgement of its past, and to Marxism as regards the exploitation of labor and the forceful introduction of capitalism, post-structuralist accounts follow Foucault's ideas to understand how dominant discourses produce docile subjects. In the South African colonial situation, blacks were constructed as mere bearers of bare life and sources of labor whose value depends on capitalist market forces. In his response to studies of power, Foucault raised suspicions about the exclusive emphasis on repression and examined how power produces positive moral codes and associated behaviors by which subjects eventually police themselves. This equally violent dimension of power is located in discourse and corresponds to Fanon's understanding of the geography of power, its regulation, and the production of racialized subjects in the colonial situation. The colonial conception and later the national elite of subalterns as bearers of bare life, ever vulnerable to violence, cannot be understood without examining Foucault's thinking about how discourses constitute modern subjects, which largely overlaps with that of Fanon. In his article Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, Foucault expressed his debt to Nietzsche for the latter's idea of genealogy, which differs from conventional forms of analyzing the past. Traditional methods, which Foucault called total history, entailing composing grand explanatory systems and teleological processes and celebrating great events as individuals. The sought-after prize is the discovery of the single explanatory factor for major historical processes. Genealogy searches for the discredited, the neglected, and a whole range of phenomena which have been denied a history. For example, reason, punishment, and sexuality. Genealogy also rejects the search for origins, first and ultimate causes that are embedded in prior discourses and terrains of struggle, difficult if not impossible to identify and contingent on other factors. Foucault instead searched for beginnings. His stand against origins raised questions about timelines, essences such as the singular empirical truths that account for modes of production or foundations of knowledge. His beginnings may be numberless points of departure that may represent different narratives and therefore different ways of telling the past. In distinguishing genealogy of descent from emergence, Foucault relates his methodological approach to two aspects of the power-knowledge relationship: the ways powers interact to make subjects and the ways subjects react and participate in politics. He traced the constitution of the modern subject backwards from the present by using his method to understand how we became like this and also how we came to take these identities for granted. He examines discontinuities, the multiplicity of factors behind an event, and seeks to identify the accidents, the minute deviations, the errors that gave birth to those things that continue to exist and have value for us. The genealogy of descent avoids historical constants, essences, and uninterrupted continuities, all of which posit a, quote, stable past. The genealogy of emergence, in contrast, explores the marginalization of subjective knowledges of the other and considers historical developments as transitory manifestations of relationships of domination, subordination, as temporary embodiments of the underlying relationship of forces. The attention is on confrontations, conflicts, and struggles that constitute subjects differently than, and even in opposition to, the structures and techniques of power. Foucault's earlier structuralist sympathies discouraged him from reducing historical events to individual actors' intentions. Instead, he saw historical events as eruptions of forces. Breaking with traditional analysis, he aimed to foreground ahistorical qualities such as feelings, sentiment, morality, and the physiology, and to draw attention to the local rather than the global, and the particular rather than the general. Instead of discussing Foucault's studies through the lens of power or knowledge nexus or his critique of Enlightenment reason from a modern European perspective, it makes sense to follow Rainbow, 1984, and focus on Foucault's work on the constitution of the modern subject as it reveals strong similarities to Fanon. Rainbow, 1984, proposed that Foucault discussed the objectification of the modern subject in three modes. First, particular othered groups are targeted, spatially separated and monitored with dividing practices. Foucault illustrated these techniques of power in the isolating of lepers in the Middle Ages, the confinement of the poor, insane, and homeless to the Hospital General in 1656, and the practices of punishment, discipline, and modern imprisonment. The discourses of power resort to strategic, sophisticated techniques to categorize and classify populations with the intention of developing knowledge about targeted others and regulating the insiders and the normals. Examples include the definition of sexual deviance in clinical medicine in the 19th century and the rise of psychiatry, which targeted the insane as its subjects. These discourses produce the effects of medicalization, stigmatization, and normalization of modern subjects, but ultimately concern the regulation of life and the rest of society. Foucault argued that the subject became objectified by the process of division, either within himself or herself, or from others, a point about the splitting of the subject also found in Fanon's thought. Foucault's historical studies empirically expand on these processes while spelling out their theoretical implications. He researched how individuals are drawn from an undifferentiated mass or specially targeted populations, such as delinquents of working-class communities, the relationship between othering practices and social science knowledge, the link between the practices of classification, containment, and control to a tradition of humanitarian reform, the increased efficiency of techniques in the exercise of power and accumulated knowledge, and lastly, the application of these procedures to dominated groups whose very identities were the result of such dividing practices. Second, the subject is objectified through scientific classification, which extends the role of knowledge as a form of power. From the gathering of detailed information about individual subjects to whole bodies of knowledge about indigenous societies and their natural habitats, this was characteristic of the colonial project. Foucault did not dwell on knowledge in the colonial situation, but concerns himself with its production in the human sciences. How did the human science emerge, and under what historical conditions of the organization of power? In The Order of Things, 1973, Foucault explained the discourses of life, labor, and language, and showed how they became scientific disciplines with a high degree of internal autonomy and coherence. He avoided the typical developmentalist approaches that traced a continuity of ideas in a discipline from lower to higher stages, but looked for abrupt changes and significant, drastically discontinuous paradigm shifts. This work is staunchly materialist because, according to Rainbow, Foucault saw nothing beyond discourse as more real and expressive of an essence. In his earlier studies, Foucault concentrated on discourse as systems of ideas and ignored institutions, routinized practices, everyday techniques, and strategies of power or knowledge. Later, he adopted a wider field of analysis to include non-discursive practices, although the tension between the discursive and non-discursive always remained. Besides accusations of Eurocentrism, Foucault was also criticized for his understanding of resistance to power, a mere assertion that where there is domination, there will be resistance. It has rightly triggered a mountain of critical responses. Third, Foucault was interested in the positive aspects of power and the regulation not of death, but life and moral grounding, which he wrote about in 1978 in the first volume of The History of Sexuality. He recognized intentionality and self-interest here more than in his earlier works, taking as examples the French bourgeois of the 19th century, Greek citizens, early Christian ascetics, and church fathers. This third mode, unlike the first two, focus on the complex interaction between discourses of power and the role of humans in contributing towards their own subjective, in which the individual policed him or herself in relation to an objectified subject. His introduction of power as biopolitics, targeting both the regulation of whole populations and the very private domains of the individual, again resonates with Fanon, especially on the black person's subjectivity being trapped in his skin due to racist discourse. Foucault's studies of Europe explore how the exercise of power operates through a broad range of activities to discipline the population, derive knowledge for power, and represent the world. But what are its implications for settler-colonial situations such as that of South Africa? Although colonial knowledge cannot be discounted in the construction of subjects, the differences between Western modernity and the colonial situation are the role of the colonial state and its reliance on violence to form docile subjects. To accomplish and sustain domination, colonial power required an expansive administrative system that worked through local native structures and relied on local knowledge. After all, the missions were to exploit, educate, and produce new, radically different modern subjects. As Mitchell noted, these processes of knowledge, institutions, and tactical practices of domination had a two-way trajectory and became part of the state-building and productive process in Europe. The colonial situation and the constitution of class. Fanon and Foucault's work allows for a specific kind of inquiry into and understanding of the nature of settler colonialism as the racial ordering of social relations dependent on violence and the production of particular types of racial subjects. The imposition of laws on people who did not have the vote and were therefore outside the political community blurred the distinction between law and violence. The state could implement such laws only by violence, intimidation, and policing. It also required extensive information gathering to monitor and evaluate the black life and behavior and of the effectiveness of laws, so blacks spied and reported on each other. This situation approximates the state of exception, as Agamben argued, but the exceptional features were permanent in settler colonial conditions. This constituted the subject identities of the targeted people, as did the simultaneous exclusion from and inclusion in the political community. The relationship between law, violence, and the production of subjects can be illustrated with just two economic examples: the forced recruitment of black labor to the mines and the privileging of white labor over black labor. The formative years of capitalist industrialization, spurred on by the mining industry, established relations grounded in settler colonialism, which followed from the earlier racial division of labor in South Africa. As is typical of settler colonial forms of modernity, capitalist industrialization consolidated the white working class as a labor aristocracy, a comfortable sector of the privileged settler community. The mining industry made labor exploitation and practices of disciplining the subject more detailed and systematic, so the black and subaltern population bore the brunt of extra economic controls. The deep disposition of gold was the accepted explanation for the extreme exploitation of black mine workers. The international fixed price compelled mine bosses to keep labor costs low to compete on the world market. The mining industry targeted the vulnerable. It saw in the defeated African kingdoms potentially large supplies of workers, and colonial norms meant that it could pay them subsistence wages, the bare minimum to keep them alive, and control and regulate them through restrictive and repressive policing mechanisms. The economic rationale for coercive labor rules was not too far from the colonial imagination. The political and ideological context of mannequin society had already paved the way, making violent super-exploitation possible and morally justifiable. Valuing their independence, African small peasant farmers at first refused to work deep underground. The conditions were dangerous, and they could be thousands of miles away from their homes and families. So, the Cape Parliament and Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, passed the Glen Grey Act in 1894, that bill for Africa, to force African peasantry into mine work. They had to pay taxes, quit rent, for the small patches of land on which they subsisted. Only 4 morgen of land qualified for tax, and those not fortunate enough to have access to land had to pay to discourage squatting. Overnight, it created a landless peasantry whose only choice to pay new taxes was to seek work in the mines. Lipton quoted Rhodes's belief that the law was a gentle stimulant to remove them from that life of sloth and laziness, to teach them the dignity of labor. The Transvaal Republic added pass laws to state legislation in 1895, further enforcing large-scale labor migrancy. The collaboration of chiefs increased the financial pressure by demanding the payment of tributes from mine work. To make the African peasantry seek work in the money economy, the colonial state further reduced their land access with the Land Act in 1913. The betterment schemes of the Native Land and Trust Act in 1936 violently forced the removal of thousands from communal lands and restricted African land ownerships to reserves that eventually became Bantustans under Verwoordian apartheid. It also expanded the tax regime to include hut and POL taxes. But mine-owning capitalists kept complaining about labor shortages and even brought in 50,000 Chinese workers under indenture following the Boer War. They abandoned this scheme after a few years of uneconomical and politically sensitive as news spread about the terrible working conditions and treatment of the Chinese. The mine owners, whose interests were coordinated through the Chamber of Mines, supplemented the colonial state's regime of laws by establishing their own recruitment mechanisms, such as the Witwatersrand Native Labour Association, WNLA, in 1902. Its recruitment was systematic in rural areas. African peasants gave themselves up to WNLA officials, got themselves documented, completed their health inspections, entered into annual 6-month contracts for mine work in the Vaal region, and paid part of their wages for everyday living rations. Like Foucault's reading of the efficiencies of military barracks, the mines housed the men in single-sex hostels called compounds. Gardner Frederick Williams, manager of De Beers at its Kimberley operations and Rhodes's close friend, described the first ones in the Kimberley diamond mines in a way that resonates strongly with Foucault's analysis of the rationalization of space to produce docile subjects. Fully 4 acres are enclosed by the walls of De Beers' compound, giving ample space for the housing of its 3,000 inmates, with an open central ground for exercise and sports. The fences are of corrugated iron, rising 10 feet above the ground, and there is an open space of 10 feet between the fence and the buildings. Iron cabins fringe the inner sides of the enclosure, divided into rooms 25 feet by 30 feet, which are lightened by electricity. In each room, 20 to 25 natives are lodged. The beds supplied are ordinary wooden bunks, and the bed clothing is usually composed of blankets that the natives bring with them or buy at the stores in the compound, where there is a supply of articles to meet the simple needs of the natives. Besides these stores, there is a hospital and dispensary. In the center of the enclosure, there is a large concrete swimming bath. Their living quarters and work were fit for a subject that is half man, half beast. Treating residents like prison inmates, these disciplinary institutions threatened death, but systematically regulated the details of migrant workers' lives and monitored their behavior to warn of the ongoing threat of potential unrest. The internal architecture and spatial arrangement of the buildings made for easy and continuous surveillance, discouraging protests and worker absenteeism. In the compound, the arrangement of the living space and organization of underground work encouraged primordial ethnic identities. The workers were divided along tribal lines by language to prevent a class-conscious identity from taking root. Remarkably, this strategy was successful for decades. Being observed at work by management and by the police and state officials in the broader society taught black subjects how to evade, hide, and, quote, break the law, which became another element of identity. The capitalist class's reliance on extra economic interventions allowed it to enjoy higher profits on the back of lower wages. White workers too had benefited enormously under racialized rule, with wages 18 times higher than their black counterparts, or almost 40% of the total wage bill. They defended their privilege using organized politics. The dominant ideology underpinning settler colonialism bolstered their claims. Believing that their class belonged to the dominant racial group, they demanded that black workers' wages not undercut their own, and that they perform tasks traditionally reserved for civilized workers. The 1922 strike of thousands of white miners became a civil revolt whose outcome influenced a change of government. The standard Marxist argument of the skilled, unskilled division of labor and the calculating interests of mine workers cannot explain the historic absence of a united working class politics in South Africa without reference to the long tradition of settler colonialism and the mediation of class interest through the lens of race. Popular slogans of the strike, such as "Workers of the World Unite and Fight for a White South Africa," reveal the strange mix of socialist internationalism and entrenched racism. In comparison to white workers, and due primarily to state restrictions before black union organized, black workers' wages remained low. Black workers may have called the odd strike, 1946 was an exception, but they were generally compliant, passive, and fearful of the white world for decades. The 1973 strikes of black workers were dramatic because the experience of spontaneous, collective action introduced new levels of worker identity, organization, and militancy, ushering in a new era of worker collective action. The racialized labor system, the backbone and model for the construction of right-less subjects throughout South Africa, influenced all sectors of the economy. Labor tenancy on farms allowed farmers to exploit workers under the extreme conditions of patrimonial familiarity that sustained traditional practices from the Boer farmers of the early colonial period. Because the conditions and wages of farm work were unattractive, farmers prevented workers from taking up employment in other sectors, locking whole families into long-term generational contracts. From the early settlement, laws regulated the movement of blacks between the territory's white and black zones. This mode of control, which is essential to mannequin society, would have been unthinkable without the tradition of race division that had been established under settler colonial conditions. The influx control laws became the modern symbol of blacks' semi-human status, connecting rightlessness, labor exploitation, and the absence of human dignity. Crucially, the settler colonial situation made available a race identity and the traditions of corresponding ideology of white superiority and racial, civilized slave dichotomies. The political community of and for whites provided them with access to the modern bureaucratic state that was used to both exclude and include blacks, leaving blacks in a permanent state of ambiguity in relation to the system of domination. Apartheid takes mannequinism to its logical extreme. Settler colonialism had its structural basis in the racialized organization of labor. In its expression as apartheid, it imposed a rationalized system of domination that evolved pragmatically as responses to a political field and its competing social forces. Even though policies regulating relations between whites and blacks were based on violence, the apartheid project, especially the pernicious policies of land and labor exploitation, gave itself the appearance of legality. This legalizing of white supremacist discourse framed institutions and regulated daily material practices, creating everyday cultures. 2 years after the 1946 Black Mine Workers' Strike, the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, NP, assumed power after campaigning on behalf of Afrikaner nationalism and warnings about the Swart Gevaar. The party revised racist laws, added others, and broke with the past by developing the capacity of the state to implement its vision vigorously. Apartheid focused on grand changes to society as a whole, the life of society and the behavior of individuals in their everyday detail at the micro-individual level. Seeley observed that apartheid was always a work in progress. A system, an ideology, a coherent blueprint? No, rather a pragmatic and tortuous process aimed at consolidating the leadership of a nationalist movement in order to safeguard the self-determination of the Afrikaner. Although many laws and social practices of racial separation had been long enough established that verwoord could reasonably refer to racial separation as tradition, the apartheid period is best characterized by the systematic manner, explicit ideological grounding, and modern rational approach to mannequin society. 3 different phases of apartheid are identifiable. In the 1950s, the NP was unsure about the long-term policy implications of its ideology, so it focused on the systematic classification of racial groups and the establishment of strict residential separation. In the 1960s, the Verwoerd government faced a more favorable domestic environment, with impressive economic growth, weak and ineffective black protest, and Verwoerd's confidence in his leadership of the party and government. It removed the remaining indirect representation available to blacks, vigorously restricted African movement through the pass laws, and embarked on its Bantustan independence strategy. In the period after the Soweto revolt in the late 1970s, the government felt compelled to reform old-style apartheid and proposed expanding black representation at local government level, recognizing black trade unions and loosening restrictions on African movement. It still refused to grant equal citizenship without regard to race. Conventional conceptions of apartheid emphasized the racial exclusion that defined the political community and its legal implications, assuming that subjective identities were already there. Thus, Gilumi and Schlemmer identified the key areas of apartheid as labor regulation, communal apartheid, and political control. The labor influx controls legalized migrant labor and disallowed African trade unionism. Communal apartheid legislation separate across the amenities, education and welfare, and political control defined the political system, giving whites exclusive control of the state and passing laws that differentiated spending and the distribution of resources according to race classification. Baynard's summary of apartheid follows this emphasis on political legal aspects without much discussion of the politics of subject formation. For him, the main features included the rigid definition of the various races, exclusive white control of central political institutions, the separation of all public institutions, services, and territories between whites and blacks, and amongst blacks, the spatial separation between urban and rural areas, the control of African movement between rural and urban areas, the rigid hierarchical divisions within the labor market with jobs assigned on a racial basis, and the social separation and hierarchy of quality of all services and products, from education to park benches. Immediately after its election victory, and responding to its promises to end the poor white problem and the related fear of misegregation, miscegenation, the national government hurriedly legislated the Mixed Marriages Act, 1949, to disallow interracial marriage, and the Immorality Act, 1950, to prohibit interracial sex. In 1950, the government also passed the Population Registration Act, whose legacy indelibly marks the South African state, society, and generalized consciousness. It mandated that all citizens be classified into racial groups, with their life prospects determined by the group designation. The introductory section defined racial subjects rationally. The text placed certainty in the arena of the political. A colored person means a person who is not white, who is not a white person or a native. A native means a person who in fact is or is generally accepted to be a member of any Aboriginal race or tribe of Africa, and a white person means a person who in appearance obviously is or who is generally accepted as a white person, but does not include a person who, although in appearance obviously white, is generally accepted as a colored person. The Group Areas Act of 1950 forced thousands to relocate, assigning the most valuable areas to whites and moving blacks far from designated white areas. The government's Separate Amenities Act of 1953 provided for separate and unequal services to different race groups. Fanon's compartmentalized mannequin world was thus made into law, implemented and kept in place by state violence. Introduced by its history, South Africa bucked post-World War II trends. When anti-racism and decolonization gained momentum elsewhere, the South African government stridently announced its white supremacist ideology. When many countries were extending public education to their citizenry, South Africa implemented its Bantu education policy in 1953 to de-educate blacks and produce subjects believed to be required by its economy and dual market system. It aimed to massify black education. However, the educational content aimed to produce modern, yet docile, tribalized, racialized subjects who were expected to tolerate bare life. Post-World War II capacities of the state improved dramatically. The NP National Party embarked on the large-scale recruitment of Afrikaners to dismantle the historical English dominance of the police and the military. The new leaders rationalized their surveillance and control of subalterns, focusing on the details of policing and utilizing the latest methods. They deployed the state's repressive arsenal, creating a vast apparatus of rules and new technologies to observe, monitor, and evaluate, starting with implementing the pass laws more effectively. On the ground, policing the vast apparatus of rules under which the subaltern lived entailed rewards, threats, and punishments, fines, and jail terms. The successful process of state building and encouraging racialized ethnic consciences were well thought out machines, leading white and black subjects to find their places in society and believe that they could easily predict the other's behavior. Only the popular mobilizations from the 1970s made blacks aware of and uncomfortable with their historical docility and their everyday non-disruptive role in the success of apartheid. The combination of powers, which targeted the black population in discourses of health, labor, and education, and watched over everyday individual racial separation, demanded that they operate on multiple levels. Enforcing and monitoring strict racial separation required subjects who self-policed to laws that segregated playgrounds, water fountains, entrances, lifts, escalators, and seating arrangements in cinemas and buses. Strict racial separation in social life, except in the sphere of production, was the apartheid solution to the long-term settler-colonial issue of a small white minority living amongst a large black majority and having qualitatively different relationships to the European Enlightenment and capitalist modernity. In the 1960s, the government did not focus on the so-called petty apartheid of Jim Crow-like separation, i.e., the inconveniences, humiliations, and indignities that blacks experienced, such as having no access to water fountains on very hot days or toilet facilities, and being looked upon and treated with scorn by whites. The government focused on grand apartheid, namely the Bantustan project to create independent ethnic African homelands in a federal system of southern African states. Treating blacks as racially different, inhuman, and of lower status to whites created deep-seated anger and resentment. Apartheid rule was at its most arrogant in the 1960s after the Sharpeville massacre, and it is remembered for the layers of humiliation, the absence of dignity, and the long silence of any real black resistance. Verwoerd's policy envisaged that Africans would exercise citizenship in their own states. When the policy was fully implemented, no person classified as African, besides the few exempt from Bantustan residency, could claim South African citizenship. The Transkei, Tatswana, Venda, and Ciskei became independent states in quick succession in the 1970s with lavish ceremonies that almost mimicked the independent flag raisings in other parts of Africa during the 1950s and 60s. A new elite, which Amilcar Cabral would call Comprador class, and an ethnic middle class benefited from the new states' budgets and patronage, but the Bantustans were not internationally recognized due to successful campaigns that highlighted their false independence. The post-1976 apartheid period witnessed government attempts at political reforms. The reforms were spurred on by pressure from business interests afraid that white supremacy was undermining profits, but other factors also motivated the political class to favor reforms. Typical Marxist analysis of the reform period highlights changes in tensions within the structure of South African capitalism, demonstrating the importance of identifying both contradictions in the capitalist structure and the limitations of ignoring state autonomy and the politics surrounding the constitution of relational subjects. The influence of big capital on the apartheid state cannot be underestimated. At the same time, the autonomy and institutionalist interests of the Botha-led security state was all too evident. Even when it pursued a reform agenda, it ultimately showed itself unable to think beyond the parameters of settler colonialism and its identities. Reading off the needs of the economic structure, the monopoly capital phase accordingly brought with it more mechanization and the need for skilled labor. Additionally, changes in South African class structure motivated the racial organization of society represented by apartheid functionally needed to be reformed. O'Meara discovered that the turning point towards a new monopoly phase of capitalist development in South Africa was as early as the 1946 mine workers' strike. Monopoly capitalism ended the dual economy of pre-capitalist and capitalist modes of accumulation, which constituted a dominant Marxist reading of pre-war South African society. The growth and influence of finance capital in the 1960s brought Afrikaner and English capital together, creating organic links between state, national, and international capital. Statistical data reveals that these economic changes between Statistical data reveals these economic changes. Between 1963 and 1968, the GDP increased by an average annual rate of 9.3%, compared to 5.2% between 1957 and 1962. The manufacturing and construction sectors grew due to mining capital diversifying into these sectors. Additionally, the political restrictions faced by the black working class prevented them from accessing the machinery of labor relations and kept wages low. By emphasizing that this monopoly capitalist phase was reached due to marginal growth in secondary industrialization this analysis can make related claims about necessary social changes. The decreased profits in mining and agriculture and the loss of South African workers to manufacturing compelled mining capital to employ more workers from Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Botswana. The composition of the capitalist class changed when the concentration of capital increased. By 1981, 8 conglomerates and the state corporations controlled 70% of the total assets of the largest 138 companies. The Anglo-American Mining Corporation controlled 54.1% of all the companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The Afrikaans-owned Sanlam Insurance Company, 11.3%. The white working class was dwindling, and many had moved into the middle class as a consequence of apartheid policy. Lastly, a black middle class emerged as splits in the black working class between skilled and unskilled workers became increasingly important. Blacks increasingly took up employment at lower wages in jobs formerly reserved for whites, and some employers split a skilled job into several unskilled categorized jobs. These social changes indicate conflicting class interests that complicated the once unquestioned racial unities of an earlier period. The mine capitalists wanted migrant labor to continue. The manufacturing capitalist lobbied for government reforms to allow some blacks to have rights to live in urban areas. The Afrikaner business sector and the enlarged Afrikaner middle class lost uncritical support for apartheid and had difficulty justifying petty racial separation, especially by the 1980s, when blacks defined the majority and the people. The generalized black exclusion from the political system opened tensions in the previously formidable white consensus. The government eventually realized it was impossible to maintain social control in this way of representing a small minority in a country inhabited by a large and culturally different majority claiming aboriginal legitimacy. The economic growth of the 1960s spurred on urbanization. Urban black settlements and townships became the source of mass mobilization, ushering in a new politics from the 1970s. Large informal black housing settlements formed around the main towns by the 1980s. State authorities and white political parties urgently debated how best to balance the demands for labor with social and political consequences that might threaten white privilege. The democratic regime elected in 1994 has not reversed these politics, as mobilization politics continues to be evident throughout political society. Conclusion. After 3 centuries of systematic consolidation of the racial organization of civil society produced mannequin society, harboring many lines of tension, violence or the threat of violence, militarized police functioning as intermediaries between colonizer and subalterns, and enforced laws that mostly operated in a state of exception towards subalterns. The violence, rigorous policing, and the ambiguity of law mirror Agamben's concept of the state of exception, or a situation of martial law. It potentially made every black treatable as a criminal. Concepts like Arendt's interwar refugees and Agamben's Homo Seca resonate in South Africa. In the post-1994 context of rights and a new assertiveness as citizens, legacies of wounded subjects reveal unresolved internal psychological battles, a point Fanon reiterated, and demonstrate the limitations of procedural democracy compounded by neoliberal capitalism.